Before we start this lesson, let's refresh your memory a bit with things you may know or things you may remember hearing about. Atoms are composed of protons and neutrons that live in the nucleus and electrons that orbit the nucleus in energy levels. Most atoms are combined into molecules. A molecule is a neutrally charged group of atoms that is held together by covalent bonds. Electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom in energy levels or shells. In all but the smallest atoms, the outer energy shell likes to have 8 electrons in it. Atoms love to have their outer shells filled with 8 electrons. This is called the octet rule. If an atom doesn't have its outer shell full of 8 electrons naturally, it will try to fill it by bonding with other atoms. Sometimes an atom will lose an electron, or 2, or 3, in order to have their outer shell full. Sometimes they gain electrons. It all depends on what's easier. If there are only 2 electrons in the outer shell, it is easier to lose 2 than to gain 6. If they lose 2 electrons, the lower shell, which is now the outer shell, will still be full, so it is still happy. Atoms like to be stable. They go to great lengths to be stable and happy. Stability to an atom is a complete outer energy level. The outer energy level is full of the valence electrons. Valence electrons are the electrons in the highest occupied energy level of an atom. The number of valence electrons mostly determines the properties of an element. An octet is a set of 8. Think octopus, an animal with 8 legs, or octagon, a figure with 8 sides. In chemistry, the octet rule says that atoms like to have full outer shells of only 8 electrons. Atoms will lose or gain valence electrons to make their outer shells full with 8 electrons, and they do this by bonding with other atoms. Those atoms can be the same element as when oxygen bonds with itself to form O2, or with different elements, such as water, H2O. The exceptions to the octet rule are hydrogen and helium, which are both happy with 2 electrons in their outer shells. As in most things in this world, atoms, electrons, molecules, etc., like to be in a state where they exert the least amount of energy. Just like you at the end of a long day, lying on the couch expending little energy seems like the best thing in the world. Atoms bond together because in doing so they enter a lower energy state. Compounds form when the outer shell electrons are lost or gained. The electrons that participate in chemical bonding are called the valence electrons. When 2 atoms share electrons to fill their outer shell, it is called a covalent bond. A covalent bond is when atoms share 1 or more electrons. Covalent bonds form because the energy exerted to stay together is much less than the energy needed to break them apart and form isolated atoms. This is because the chemical reaction releases energy, and each atom moves to a lower energy state when they enter the bond. Covalent compounds are formed when a compound is held together by covalent bonds, and the atoms share valence electrons. These elements are sharing their electrons because neither one of them has the strength to take the electrons from the other. Because they are sharing them, rather than transferring them as they do in ionic bonds, the bond isn't as strong as other types. Since the bond in a covalent compound isn't that strong, they are easy to break apart. This means it is easy to move them from a solid state to a liquid state, and from a liquid state to a gaseous state, giving them low melting and boiling points. These weak bonds also mean that covalent compounds are relatively soft. Since the bonds break easily, the molecules can move past each other easily, which makes them flexible. Covalent bonds are what turn rubber from a rubber tree, along with sulfur, into a compound flexible enough to make basketballs, or tires for cars. Atoms are composed of protons and neutrons that live in the nucleus. Electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom in energy levels or shells. In all but the smallest atoms, the outermost energy shell likes to have 8 electrons in it. This is called the octet rule. Atoms like to combine into molecules and compounds because they are at a lower energy state when they do so. When 2 atoms share their electrons to form a compound, it is called a covalent bond, and the compound is called a covalent compound.